Good evening and welcome to another edition of Black Focus. I'm your host, Ron Edwards, coming to you from the corporate headquarters of MTN here in Minneapolis, if you will. We've kind of just been informed that there may be some problems with the streaming, but it doesn't make any difference. The program will still be aired on Sunday and all during the week. We are basically today, as an outgrowth of some circumstances that have taken place in the last 24 hours, going to take a look at a Pacific incident that first started 14 years ago here in the city of Minneapolis. It was an incident that involved information in the form of a statement given by a citizen who had observed a shooting between two gangs, if you will, one day at a stoplight in North Minneapolis. A young lady, 19 years of age at that particular time, did what any good citizen would do, or certainly they are encouraged to do, and that was she gave a statement to the police. She was not involved. She happened to be parked at the stoplight when two automobiles pulled on kind of each side of her, and gunmen in the tradition of television got out and started shooting at each other, if you will. This young lady, as we said, gave a statement to a police officer who was allegedly the investigator of the shooting, involved with the gang unit at that particular time, a gang unit that later became notorious and legendary with regards to their conduct and etc. A number of weeks later, this young lady and her family, who resided on the 1400 block of Thomas Avenue North, began to receive threatening calls. And then a short time after that, the house on the 1400 block was shot up by quote-unquote gang members, if you will. The young lady in question was told in a telephone call that she was a snitch and that clearly they were going to get her, quote unquote. She basically knew who they were based on the two rival gangs that had fought a gun battle with her caught in the middle. At some point in time, it was decided that things had become so dangerous that the family began to contemplate moving from the house on the 1400 block of Thomas Avenue North. About that same time, an event happened in the Hennepin County Jail where an intercept of a letter from an inmate there, who just also happened to be one of those involved in the gun battle, was sent to one of his associates, if you will. And that associate indicated that he wanted a contract placed on the young lady, that she was a snitch, and that he had her statement. And he, in fact, read to her at one point some of the statement testimony she had given to the Minneapolis Police Department, and particularly this individual who is still a sergeant in the Minneapolis Police Department. In fact, this individual works with so-called gun situations and et cetera, if you will. Situation became so tenuous after the letter was intercepted that the sheriff at that time, Richard Stanek, gave the letter to the prosecutor. The prosecutor then gave it to the judge who was handling the case, and the judge was so appalled by the threats and the boldness of the gang member that he gave him an additional 2 years in a sentence that had to do with a felon in possession of a weapon. In fact, this individual just got out of jail in July of 2017, according to the information. The family in question, who we will not identify at this particular point in time because of the danger that is still hanging over this family, was relocated, actually under the auspices and the coordination of the sheriff's office, to a safe house, if you will. In other words, they were moved into a new home, a different home, in the far southern part of the county. The family stayed there for about 3 years until the mother of this family, one young lady and 3 males, decided that they would not be intimidated and wanted to come back into Minneapolis, be around their friends, and etc., though they knew the dangers, if you will. And so that situation was always in the back of the mind of the family who lived on the 1400 block of Thomas Avenue North about 14 years ago. And then there were a series of events that took place with regards to the 3 male members of the family. The mother took up the issue of making sure that her family was safe. At one point in time, the mother asked for a meeting with the then chief of police of the Minneapolis Police Department, Tim Dolan. And in that meeting, as an example, was 2 other people, one of them being Mike Martin, a so-called gang expert, if you will, and at that time, if I'm not mistaken, commander, inspector, if you will, of the 4th Precinct there on Plymouth Avenue. The mother asked that action be taken with regards to the continued threats that were taking place, if you will. The chief and Commander or Inspector Martin indicated certainly would. And at that time, the person in charge of fugitive apprehension was a gentleman by the name of Kramer, very well-respected police officer. He headed up the fugitive task force, if you will, would go out and round up the bad people, if you will. Unfortunately, it was determined upon further investigation and examination that Kramer was never given an order by the office of the chief to pick this individual up. Now, this was prior, obviously, to the letter being intercepted from the jail after this person was finally taken into custody, not because of anything threatening an African-American female and her family. It had to do with an incident that this person was involved in downtown Minneapolis, in which white citizens were placed in danger. And the prosecutor, county attorney, and others decided that something had to be done with this person and that could not and should not be allowed to happen. It's one of the reasons we've put the book up here that talks about the fight for justice. It's a book that deals with the struggles, if you will, of the civil rights movement and some of the undercover things that were done by government entities, if you will, be it municipal, county, state, or the good old feds. And we're going to be moving into a role that the feds began to play after some events in 2015. And so this family continued to live as good citizens, always looking kind of over their shoulder, knowing that they were a target because a Minneapolis police officer who was working the original investigation actually was controlling and playing gang members off against each other, which is over a long period of time has led to a number of young African Americans being killed because of information that was provided. In fact, for those of you that really follow these narratives and et cetera, I remind you of an interview with then council member Brian Herron, Democrat 8th Ward, in which he talked in terms that he had a tape recording of a Minneapolis detective giving information to a Southside gangster, if you will, about conversations that were going on between the police and an individual who, shortly after that, was shot and killed execution style. Again, that was a broadcast, if you will, on a couple of our local television stations a long time ago, 15, 16 years ago. And at that time, the person that had the information and didn't do anything with it was the now Reverend Brian Herron, but at that time he was councilman in the 8th Ward in South Minneapolis. All of these become relevant because back then even, was the presence as we were moving into and trying to come out of Murderapolis, which BET was in town for 2 weeks, taping a program and interviewing people who maintained that they were a part of bringing order and control, though in talking about safe streets and ceasefire and et cetera. There was no safe streets and ceasefire programs. It was United for Peace that, quote unquote, was dealing with the problems in the streets in that period of 1992, 93, 94, 95. In fact, this was the period in which the police officer Jerry Hoff was assassinated, shot and killed in the Chicken Shack there in South Minneapolis. All of this is important for you to understand, for you to evaluate, for you to weigh, if you will, as we go now deeper and more currently. Because I know what people like to say, man, that was 15, 16, 13 years ago. Things have gotten better. In fact, there was an article in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune by a reporter in which he was talking with what used to be the GVI group, the Gang Violence, Group Violence Initiative group, and et cetera, and how well things are going. By the way, in the last 5 days, we have had at least 7 African Americans shot, 2 killed, if you will, in very mysterious circumstances in North Minneapolis, and then at least another 5. And by the way, on that particular note, our prayers go out to the Ferguson family as they, quote unquote, are overseeing the recovery of their loved ones after a major shootout in downtown Minneapolis last weekend that left 3 people seriously wounded, 2 of them, 1 male, 1 female, who lost an eye each, if you will. Real tragic. Also, our condolences to the Minnewacan tribe, if you will, for the 2 young ladies were affiliated with the Minnewacan tribe. And again, our heartfelt condolences go out to the Ferguson family and to the Minnewacan tribe, and et cetera. Hopefully, they'll have someone in custody one of these days. Now, this all then ties in to a series of shootings and killings and et cetera, just in the last 7 or 8 day period. We're not talking about 7 months, 7 years, 70 years, and et cetera. We're talking about a state of war that is existing in your city, and the media has shut down, closed down the importance of journalistic integrity and et cetera. And I'm talking about both the print media, the visual media, and et cetera. And so yesterday, in our beloved city, we had another African American lose their life. By the way, there will be 3 funerals in the next week of African Americans who have died from drug overdose. Bad drugs being intentionally brought in and given to people in the African American communities here in the Twin Cities. There will be a funeral Friday, just for those that run around and talk in terms that this is fake news, the brother must be making that up, that it ain't happening. There will be a funeral Friday for a 32-year-old African American woman with a 3-year-old daughter who died, if you will, of an overdose, if you will. Everybody in the hood knows who the persons are that are selling these bad drugs, if you will, that are taking the lives of so many young people, but specifically so many young African Americans. Again, there will be a funeral on Friday. For those of you that are concerned, some of you were involved yesterday in the overdose fatality of a young African American in a house which has been a operating, and this is only 2 blocks away from the 4th Precinct, with its high-powered commanders and SWAT teams and et cetera. This house has been selling drugs, and traffic has been so heavy, it is unbelievable. In fact, some of the residents in the high-rise, the Housing Authority high-rise, directly across the street have complained to the Housing Authority police, and to the city, and even to the current councilman and et cetera, about the drug activities and traffic and et cetera. And people kind of wave their hand and dismiss them as irrelevant, because I guess we are, as African Americans, the sons and daughters of the African, we are considered to be irrelevant, if you will. So yesterday, early in the afternoon, a 911 call went out that a young man, a body had been found in a house there along the 1300 block of what is it, Knox? I don't know. And people rushed to the scene. You know, social media is something else, if you will. And there was a young man. He had been deceased for some time, if you will, maybe 16, 17, 18 hours, if you will. Police did arrive, but also a large crowd of friends, loved ones, relatives, and et cetera arrived. And it was interesting to hear some of the discussions, but it was even more saddened. One was more saddened, really, by the relatives of the first degree, if you will, nephews, nieces, and et cetera, particularly when this young man's body was brought out under the authority, if you will, of the Hennepin County coroner. I thought, by the way, she handled everything, this assistant coroner handled everything very well as it pertains to dealing with both the mother and father, if you will, and the young man's sister and a couple of his brothers. But what saddened me, but yet angered me, was that this young man, who there's probably no story on him, it's not important to the Star Tribune or WCCO or any of them. He's a young African American, you know, his life is forfeit, you know. If someone gave him a hot shot, if you will, then so what? You know, that's the way those people are. That means us and et cetera. I take exception to that. And so that's the reason that this afternoon I made the decision to tell this full story. It's like we said, it started some time ago when a young African-American woman thought she was doing the right thing, gave a statement to the police, and that statement was given to the gangbangers. And if it had not been for the alertness and the due diligence of the personnel at the Hennepin County Jail, the young lady probably would have been executed, if you will. And so yesterday, as I listened to loved ones and et cetera talk in terms of the young man that I already knew had been identified, if you will, I thought back to the physical and psychological pain that he had gone through. Young man who attended Minneapolis North, so he had roots here in our beloved Shangri-La, if you will. Good basketball player, people talking in terms of his basketball talents and et cetera. As I said, he had 2 other brothers and a sister, all of adult age, if you will. He had children. He loved his children, and it's probably one of the reasons that he did not leave Minneapolis. And we want you to follow this closely so there's no mistake for the naysayers and anybody else that talks in terms of how well things are going for the safety of the African American community in the Twin Cities. On the 20th of September of 2015, a young man was walking up Lowry Avenue. He was on his way to his mother's home for the annual traditional Sunday dinner. The mother of this young man really appreciated and wanted her children to enjoy the fellowship, if you will. He was walking, obviously didn't have a car. And right about there where the apartments are, if you will, on Lowry, an automobile came by slowly. And the car made the corner, if you will, but just as it was doing that, an individual leaped from the car and began to run across the street in that familiar physical, quote unquote, movement, crouching low with his weapon carrying down by his side. The young man in question was caught off guard, attempted to run. The gunman opened fire, hit him with at least 2 shots at that time. In his leg, he fell to the ground. The video in which this commentator viewed with the mother half a year later, and we'll talk in terms of the heroic effort of the mother, shows the gunman then approaching the individual who was laying prone on the ground and firing 4 more shots, shooting this individual 6 times in his lower extremities, if you will, in fact causing permanent damage to one of his legs to the extent that he was still, as of the time of his death yesterday, was still in therapy and had been in therapy since 2015, if you will. But at the time of the shooting, I don't think that the gunman, who turned out to be, listen closely now, a certified confidential informant working for the federal government, selling guns, selling drugs, if you will, and involved in a couple murders, used by the authorities, if you will, as a quote-unquote assassin, if you will, recognizable, this is important, recognizable on the video that I viewed with the mother in early 2016 at the 4th Precinct with then Assistant Chief Bruce Falcons, who had been telling the mother initially that there was no video. It was the mother, by the way, the mother of the now deceased young man, shot 6 times in his lower extremities, in the lower part of his body, by this assassin, by this federal operative, if you will, who later, by the way, because the mother of the now deceased young African American put tremendous pressure by herself, really, on authorities and et cetera. And I saw, because I went with her on a number of these meetings, and I saw individuals, starting with a white detective who now works on the so-called shooting squad, as they call it, lie to her face, make up stories, thought it was funny. This was an individual by the name of Detective Freeman. Later, I saw an African-American detective whose name I won't reveal at this particular time do exactly the same thing 3 months later when this mother came back again asking what progress was being made in the shooting of her son on Lowry Avenue on a Sunday around 2:30 or 3 o'clock. What started happening was that the mother was being played off. Minneapolis Police Department, a deputy chief, if you will, saying that they were having a hard time getting any photographs and et cetera. And so this mother, whose son took his life, lost his life because of the actions of others yesterday in a house in North Minneapolis behind the Elks Rest. This mother went out and went to a couple of businesses there on Lowry. And she explained the situation and talked in terms that her son had been shot a couple days earlier, blah, blah, if you will. And so the owners or the proprietors of these businesses indicated that she would have to get a warrant because they could not give her, under color of law, the video, if you will, though a couple of them indicated they certainly wish that they could because of the level of violence up and down that particular segment of Laurie Avenue North here in our beloved Minneapolis. She forced Chief Faulkners to go get a warrant. They got a warrant, and that's what led us to a meeting in early 2016 at the 4th Precinct. All the modern equipment was there. And of course, the police had to show her the tapes of her son being shot 6 times by a federal informant and federal sanctioned assassin, if you will. By the way, at one point in time in middle 2016, the mother had gone to the court, Hennepin County Court, downtown Minneapolis, because this federal informant was being examined, if you will, and had been charged with the sale, distribution, conspiracy, blah, blah, of drugs. He had been busted. They found everything on him. I mean, they found the drugs, they found a scale, if you will, and guns and et cetera. In fact, the police had initially had this individual under surveillance in Brooklyn Park, where there is a heavy Mexican cartel presence out there. No one wants to talk about that. They talk about it kind of now because white citizens are beginning to complain about where some of these drugs are coming from. But the cartels out of Chicago have a strong foothold in Brooklyn Park and to some degree in Brooklyn Center. But back to the events that started on the 20th day of September in 2015. So this mother went out. She went out, not the police, went out and got the video, and it showed the assassin, and it showed her son being shot. It showed the assassin running back and getting in the car, and et cetera. This is not something somebody told me. It's something I saw with my own eyes. As I said, I accompanied the mother. In fact, during 2016, we must have talked with the authorities on at least 8 occasions. On every occasion, they lied to her. And so what happened was, I had a recommendation. I said, let's see what the Fourth Estate does, what the media does, what this program does, if you will. Let us ask some of the so-called top media entities if they feel that this is a story that needs to be told. In the meanwhile, the young man shot 6 times in his lower extremities, body, and et cetera, is in therapy, and et cetera. His mother really wants him to leave the state of Minnesota. She almost lost a daughter 8, 9 years before because the police, quote unquote, had turned information over to gangsters, if you will, in an attempt to silence her, if you will. As we said, this has been a pattern that has been going on in Minneapolis longer than a lot of you want to admit to, and longer than some of you have been alive, if you will. And so the first entity that the mother reached out to was the Minneapolis Star and Tribune. And a young black reporter who was talking in terms of, believe in me, I want to do the right thing, named Boris Janey. Born in South America, if you will, Guyana or somewhere like that, who had come here, went to school in Highland Park and et cetera, had become a journalist. And one thought that Boris Janey, a reporter for the Minneapolis Star Tribune, would have an interest. In fact, in many respects, the young man in question, who is now deceased, if you will, was the same age as this reporter. So a meeting was arranged, and that meeting, and we're going to do this with all of the individuals, that meeting took place, of all places, at the Elks, there on Plymouth. The building, its back door facing the house in was this young man that his mother was attempting to acquire justice for him, if you will, was to die in, having no longer really been able to stand the pain and the discomfort of what had happened to him. And so a meeting was held at the Elks. There were probably 11 or 12 witnesses there, but we took a quiet table there at the Elks. For those that have been there, you know what we're talking about. For those of you that have not, then you have not. The mother brought tremendous amounts of evidence. She had police reports. We had, in fact, broke the quote-unquote silence that was coming out of the Minneapolis Police Department that the gentleman in question who had shot the young man who died yesterday 6 times, that this individual was, as we've said earlier in this program, a federal informant, an assassin, and in fact was involved in at least 2 to 3 murders here in the Twin Cities. And so the mother sat down with Mr. Janey, a reporter for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and began to show him the evidence. And it was quite obvious to me, as a journalist in that meeting at the Elks in the early spring of 2016, that Janey was overwhelmed. First of all, the level of information, the documentation. Yes, I repeat that, for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, a paper not worth its salt, that this reporter was overwhelmed, and instead of telling this mother that he would acquire expertise that would help him as a young reporter, he sat there, he looked this mother right in the eye, and he lied to her. This was 2016, the middle part, the spring of 2016. I knew as I watched him that this young African-American reporter had no intention of putting his reputation on the line and go up against, quote unquote, the federal authorities and the Minneapolis Police Department. I mean, it was simple as that. But you always hold out hope that there are people in the fourth estate who have the courage, the tenaciousness, the fortitude, and etc., to do what is right in the tradition of Carl Rowan, as an example, and other, quote unquote, great journalists and etc. Boris Janey did nothing, you know. I don't think he even remembers the name of the young man or remembers the mother in that meeting at the Elks Rest, the Elks Ames Lodge, as it is called. And I was so disappointed, but we gave him about 3 months and etc. But in the meanwhile, we made another approach. And this approach was to WCCO. And because of a recommendation from a journalist who worked there and who I had respect for, we sought out Liz Collier and asked her to sit down and go over the documentation. I met with her because the mother was undergoing surgery because she had had a minor stroke. Nobody talked about the stress that was almost killing her. But I went with the evidence, the packets of information, documentation, the information on how the drug charges and arrests had been dealt with. In fact, at one point, I had met with the deputy chief at an Asian restaurant on Lowry in North Minneapolis. And he had spoon-fed me all of this information about the fact that they didn't know where the shooter was. Now, this was just before we asked for a meeting at the 4th Precinct with him because the mother had gone out and gotten the video of her son being shot 6 times in the lower extremities by this confidential informant / federal assassin, if you will. And so in the meeting with Liz at Perkins in Crystal, Minnesota, it was quite clear as I watched her, as I talked about the documentation, talked about what had happened, talked about the fact that there were more assassinations and killings going on than anyone wanted to talk about. She was being presented as, quote unquote, a significant new upcoming journalist and etc. And she played the game. She said that she would get right on top of it. I left certain documents with her, copies of certain documents and etc. And I reported back to the mother that I thought that we had had maybe a successful meeting and it would be more successful, greater fruition, if you will, than with LaBoris Janey and the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Well, I was wrong. I was incorrect. In fact, what I did not know in that meeting with Liz at Perkins in Crystal is that she was involved in a relationship with a police officer who was the head of the Police Federation. In fact, he had just taken over. He had just defeated John DeMonico, a very well-respected president who served for what? John served for 18, 19 years. And so nothing happened there either, if you will. These two media giants, if you will, WCCO, CBS affiliate here in Minneapolis, did nothing. Star-Tribune did nothing. And this young man continued to suffer both emotionally and physically, if you will. And his mother became concerned about him and did everything that she could, but she continued to seek help for her son in pursuit of justice, if you will. But it was not to be. In fact, after realizing that information had been provided by WCCO to the police with regards to the information and evidence that the mother of the young man possessed, things began to take a funny turn. The mother was told by the deputy chief of police that the individual in question had been incarcerated in the state penitentiary at St. Cloud when in fact he was serving leisure time at the federal detention facility in Elk River, just north of us. Yes, he was being kept there until he could be reassigned by the federal authorities to continue his devious work. And he was reassigned to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where he was involved in some sting operations, a couple of murders, if you will, and then was reassigned to Dallas, Texas, where he apparently operated until at such time as he went dark, if you will. And so during the remainder of 2016 and all through 2017 and even the early parts of 2018, this mother has continued to call almost every other week the then former chief, now head of one of the units in the Minneapolis Police Department, Bruce. She has attempted to call you, has left messages for you, and etc., and you declined to return her message. She stopped calling CCO and Liz Collier and LaBoris Janey at the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. I think by late 2016, she realized that she was being played, if you will. There was really no concern about what had happened and about this deep, dark conspiracy that is fully in force here in our beloved Shangri-La of not only Minneapolis and St. Paul, but wherever the system decides that that's the kind of game that they want to play. It's a part of the war. And going back to the situation where this same mother's daughter had become the target for an assassination because she did the right thing. She gave a statement to the police about a shooting that she saw that she was not involved in, but she was being a good citizen. And her statement was taken by a Minneapolis police officer who is still on active duty. As we said, he's a part of the shooting team, if you will. And this officer gave her statement to a person she gave a statement against, who was powerful enough to order a death warrant to be issued and that she be assassinated. And if not for the sheriff and his personnel at the Hennepin County Jail, if you will, who gave the letter from the individual to his homie, if you will, to the prosecutor who gave it to the judge, who, as we said earlier, added 2 years onto the sentence of this individual. And so yesterday, standing there with close to 70 individuals, friends, relatives, loved ones who had come to see about this young man, and if it was true that his life had been snuffed out, if you will, that an action involving opiates and etc. had taken place, but it had to do with the pain, the physical and the emotional pain that he was feeling. In fact, at one point, the coroner, who, as I said before, did an excellent job. She handled her responsibility, as did Lieutenant Zimmerman of the Minneapolis Homicide Squad. They handled it well. It was unfortunate that none of the individuals who are being well compensated, if you will, which was reflected in the story. Just think about it. Written by LaBoris Janey in the Minneapolis Sunday edition of the paper, talking about the wonderful jobs that they are doing, the way that they have reduced crime, and even saying that this current pattern was being driven by the shooting of a young man by the name of Hampton, just in the vicinity of North Commons there on Morgan Avenue North. What was the 16th and Morgan? So yesterday, this activist, this journalist, yours truly, listened. It's always good, my friends, to listen sometimes to all individuals, to all bases, if you will, to all segments of a society, of a community, and etc. And we have known ever since the shootings downtown on early Friday morning that there is tremendous tension and there is a demand for accountability. People are getting tired of going to funerals and going to hospitals and having people play games with them as it pertains to violence, injury, fear, terror that is being directed against their loved ones, if you will. And so another young black life, the deceased on yesterday is, I think, 32 years of age, maybe a little younger. And there will be a funeral, if you will, and there will be a large turnout. There will be a large gathering there are a lot of relatives, a lot of friends. You know, when there are 3 boys and one young lady in a family, they have a lot of friends and et cetera. But I thought back, particularly as I looked at the Elks, as I looked at that building, and I thought of its history and et cetera, and I thought about that meeting in early 2016. Again, the young man was shot on the 20th day of September 2015. And I thought about the meeting with the representative, the reporter for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and I thought about how he looked so sincere as he looked into the eyes of the mother to indicate that definitely this was a story that he would certainly go with. He would be talking to his editors and et cetera. And then I thought back to the reporter, the semi-anchor for WCCO, and she was saying the same thing to me in that meeting at the Perkins Pancake House in Crystal, Minnesota, if you will. And I thought how sincere these people can be when they know they have no intention of taking on the powerful system, if you will. Donald Trump has taught us that well, that the system is all omnipotent and all powerful and et cetera. And so when I look back at the shooting in downtown Minneapolis, if you will, again, our condolences to the Ferguson family of South Minneapolis and our condolences to the Minnewacan tribe of Prior Lake, Minnesota, if you will. Some of y'all probably know them to be the owners of Mystic Lake. And I thought back to how many other situations that unfortunately I have seen this happen, where deaths take place, there is wrongdoing by those who should protect and serve, if you will. You know, and I think about this, and I think about how safe and guaranteed is our safety. And I realize that in far too many quarters, though there are some very decent individuals who do everything they can, such as the head of the Minneapolis Police Department's homicide unit, but they are still at the low level. There are other powerful people that are above them. In fact, I'm aware that the leadership, the Downtown Council, the Chamber of Commerce, Steve Kramer, you know this, if you will. Someone will call you and tell you, man, you know, black man talking and telling the business of what you folks are really committed to, like we care, if you will. That's what media, news, journalism is all about. You, the public, have a right to know. As we said at the top of this program, is that African Americans are dying in record numbers. Whatever they may think about outgoing Sheriff Richard Stanek, it was he who called attention almost 5 years ago to this opiate drug infestation that was ripping through the community. Of course, we knew that it really became a concern when white folks began to die. In fact, it was a popular chef at a cafe in uptown Minneapolis whose death, who overdosed, if you will, that really began to cause the Caucasian, the white community, the other community, to realize that this had to be addressed. And now we're seeing, even after the election, if you will, we're seeing people talking in terms, we've got to deal with this problem. Black America has been dealing with this problem for far too long. The numbers of young and older African Americans who are being found, you know, having succumbed, if you will, and then the battle over who will control the contraband, if you will, that was what led to the deaths of 2 African Americans in North Minneapolis along Dowling, and 3 blocks north of that, man found in his car, you know, I really don't know how he died, if you will. Some are saying a certain form of violence and et cetera. You know, if it was, then where's the weapon? I mean, it is sad. I don't know how many more of these gatherings of friends and loved ones and et cetera that a city, that an enclave, if you will, can stand, I assume, for as long as it's been going on in Black America and Red America, if you will, and et cetera, that it will go on for as long as the system feels that it's necessary to maintain control, to maintain discipline, if you will, to further despair and a sense that it will never change and that we are on a permanent path, if you will, of having these things happen to us and it being dismissed because we have been dismissed as the sons and daughters of the African. And so we would hope, and we apologize for the cell phone going off, but it's clear somebody's probably calling that is watching this program, if you will, here from MTN. And God bless MTN. God bless their executive director, if you will, for having the courage. There have been periods of time when we've had this courage, but far too often here in the last 10 to 15 years. And by the way, for those that maybe just got in town or et cetera, we are in our 27th year in these studios. Now, not the same ones. We initially started at what was the old Paragon building there on Plymouth Avenue, for those of you that remember when there used to be a facility there. And then later we moved to St. Anthony and et cetera. And now we're in the fortified facility in Northeast Minneapolis on Jackson Street, if you will. We have unfortunately today had to give out condolences to far too many families of color. And it does not make one have a very comfortable feeling with regards to, as we just said minutes ago, the comfort level, the feeling of safety, the feeling of caring, if you will. The story that we told you, which began with a young lady giving a statement to a police officer about an event that she saw, which she was not a part of, other than these gangs were firing across her car and et cetera, did what she thought was the right thing. And her reward was that she and her brothers and her mother had to be placed in protective custody by the sheriff of the county, if you will, in a southern suburb. Oh, I know that there are some out there listening right now that are saying, oh, I think I know who that is. Certainly, many of you know who this is. Many of you clearly remember the tension and the feeling that so tore apart that family, that led to a mother that had two minor strokes. The stress of trying to protect her loved ones. People seem to think that black mothers, black people, don't have a right to feel a concern and to attempt to protect their loved ones, their flock, their base, and et cetera. And so today, as we came into these studios here at MTN, we said that this has to be told. That the communities that basically think that we are senile and retarded as African Americans need to know that we have a damn good understanding of what is happening to us. And that in some regards and respects, genocide is closer to us and breathing on us harder than anything than we want to admit to. And that's what I saw yesterday. So I've been to many, many crime scenes and homicide scenes. And I've seen the pain, if you will. I've seen people crying out and et cetera. But it still doesn't make it acceptable, my friends. It does not mean that the sons and daughters of the African must accept that this is the norm, that this is something that you people should just look forward to. Is that what the Minneapolis Police Department was doing during that period in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018 with this mother and her family? Is this what makes people comfortable, that it ultimately led to a young man who said, I just can't take it anymore. I'm trying to medicate. I'm trying to deal with the pains. And let me tell you, as we begin to wrap, something that was said. We started to touch on it, and then we moved away from it because it was such an emotional scene. As the assistant coroner, and we say again, she did an excellent job out there. But as she was talking to the mother and getting the information as it pertains to the deceased, it was quite clear that one of the things that was said to the mother was, does your son have any fragments in his body? Yes, that coroner did. Yes, that examiner did. Does your son have any fragments in his body? She could already tell by the wounds in the victim's body that he had had penetration and wounds in his legs and etc. And when she said that, I thought as we go into the last 2 minutes or 3 minutes of tonight's program, that mother, looking around her at her friends and loved ones, had to say, God, my God, when will it end? Yes, we are emotional, sitting in this studio, because you would have to be an insensitive human being if you were not emotional about what I have seen in just this one case with regards to this young man who just finally said that I couldn't stand anymore. He could not stand anymore. And so we hope for the best. We hope that God continues his hand upon the families that we have just spoken about. Because God knows they need his help and they need his mercy. In closing, let us never be referred to as that race or group of people who are considered to be extinct because we did not stand up and we did not seek justice and we did not fight for our loved ones who had moved to the other side. God bless all of the families and the spirit of those that have departed. I'm Ron Edwards. This is Black Focus. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.